It's been 200 years since the bombs dropped. The pre-war skyscrapers are still standing, mostly intact. The highway overpasses haven't collapsed. Yet every settlement you'll find is built from corrugated tin and wood scraps, people sleeping in shacks that wouldn't survive a strong wind. Walk through any town in the wasteland and you'll see the same thing. Pre-war buildings with working foundations, intact walls, sometimes even functioning plumbing. And right next to them, someone's built a lean-to out of shopping carts. It's not a lack of materials. The ruins are everywhere, full of concrete, steel, glass. This isn't about radiation or monsters or raiders. Those are symptoms. The real problem is deeper, woven into the economic and social fabric of post-war America in ways that make rebuilding not just hard, but often fatal to attempt. The answer starts with what came before the bombs and what Vault-Tec knew was coming. October 23, 2077, 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time. The first Chinese missiles crossed into American airspace over the Bering Strait. The president's emergency broadcast lasted 30 seconds before the transmission cut. By 11:42 a.m., the exchange was over. 2 hours and 4 minutes. That's how long it took to end the world. Over 200 major cities hit in the initial strike. 400,000 megatons total yield across both sides. The Pentagon estimates put immediate casualties at 780 million worldwide. Most governments ceased to exist before lunch. The survivors crawled out of basements and metro tunnels into a world where every system had stopped. No power grid, no supply chains, no federal authority. Just dust, and the slow realization that help wasn't coming. What the survivors didn't know was that the war had been designed to fail them long before the first missile launched. Vault-Tec's public mission was preserving humanity through nuclear shelter. The company built 122 vaults across America between 2054 and 2077, each one marketed as a self-contained ark for 500 to 1,000 people. The advertisements promised safety, a new beginning. 17 of those vaults actually worked as advertised. The other 105 were experiments. Vault 11 required annual human sacrifices to keep life support running. Vault 87 exposed residents to concentrated FEV, turning them into super mutants. Vault 77 contained one man and a crate of puppets. Each vault was a controlled variable designed to test how humans break under specific conditions. The Enclave funded it, looking for data on social cohesion for their planned exodus to space or the oil rig. Vault-Tec scientists got carte blanche to answer one question: what happens when you strip away civilization and add pressure? They got their data. They also got 105 communities that would never trust institutions, never follow long-term plans, never coordinate at scale. Those experiments didn't just study human behavior. They guaranteed nobody would know how to rebuild. Vault-Tec's selection process wasn't random. When they screened applicants for the social experiments, they filtered out exactly the people who could have rebuilt civilization. Engineers who understood water treatment, agronomists who knew crop rotation, machinists who could fabricate parts from scratch. The vaults got psychologists, middle managers, teachers without textbooks. Vault 15 received 4 families with totally incompatible ideologies, but 0 members with construction experience. Vault 27 was deliberately overpopulated with 2,000 residents and no one who understood load-bearing architecture or sanitation systems. Vault 36's food extruders were designed to fail after 6 months, and they didn't include a single person trained in food preservation or farming. The competence drain was intentional. Vault-Tec wanted to see how communities responded to scarcity and conflict, not how quickly they could restore industrial capacity. So when vault doors opened decades later, the survivors knew how to fill out forms and facilitate group discussions. They didn't know how to smelt iron, generate electricity, or purify water at scale. Without expertise, the surface faced a second problem: the resource curse. The bombs didn't just kill 400 million people in the first hour. They burned 68% of Earth's topsoil into radioactive ash. Nuclear winter dropped global temperatures 20 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 years, collapsing what little agriculture survived the initial blasts. Aquifers from California to the capital wasteland measured 340 to 890 rads per liter, 170 times the lethal dose. Industrial materials fared no better. Steel mills needed coking coal, continuous electricity, and temperatures above 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Textile factories required cotton or synthetics, neither of which grew in irradiated soil. Even basic cement production demanded limestone quarries, kilns, and supply chains that no longer existed. Manufacturing anything from scratch meant solving 12 infrastructure problems simultaneously, with no tools and no margin for error. Salvage, by comparison, was simple. A pre-war office building contained 400 pounds of copper wiring you could strip in an afternoon. Supermarkets still had canned food edible 80 years later. Factories held machine tools that worked perfectly if you could scavenge fuel. For the first 50 years after the war, every survivor did the math and reached the same conclusion. The salvage could keep you alive, but it created a trap nobody saw coming. Pre-war America had built 847 million tons of structural steel, 12 million miles of copper wire, and enough consumer goods to fill 4,300,000 square feet of retail space, all of it sitting there, waiting to be claimed. Why spend 6 months learning to forge a knife when you could find 30 perfectly good ones in an abandoned kitchen supply store? The calculus was brutal. A settlement could invest 200 man-hours trying to restart a textile loom, probably fail, and get threadbare clothing. Or they could send 3 people into the ruins for 8 hours and return with 40 intact shirts, 15 pairs of boots, and 6 winter coats. Every functioning alternator scavenged from a car meant one less reason to relearn electrical engineering. Every pre-war gun found meant one less blacksmith needed. The feedback loop tightened with each generation. By 2161, 84 years after the bombs, most wastelanders had never seen anyone manufacture anything. They'd seen salvage, repair, and repurpose. They'd gotten very good at stripping resources from the old world. The skills to create a new one had atrophied completely, replaced by an entire economy built on looting the corpse of the last civilization. That logic held as long as the ruins lasted, and the ruins were designed to last. The old world had been built to survive a war, and it turned out that meant surviving long after the war ended. Pre-war construction followed military specifications that treated consumer goods like hardened installations. Vacuum tubes instead of transistors, steel frames instead of composites, analog systems with mechanical backups. When the bombs fell, this retrofuturism became an accidental time capsule. 200 years later, Nuka-Cola machines still dispensed bottles. Power armor frames held their charge. Entire office buildings stood with functioning elevators and working terminals, their data intact, their lights still responding to ancient switches. The durability wasn't planned for the aftermath. It was planned for the war itself, for facilities that needed to keep running through strikes and sieges. But that resilience poisoned the incentive to innovate. Why spend months figuring out how to smelt new steel when a pre-war girder from a collapsed overpass would outlast anything you could forge? Why breed new crops when sealed packages of Instamash sat in every grocery store basement, their preservatives still doing their job? The old world's quality control had created a safety net that caught the survivors and held them in place. While survivors picked through the past, the wasteland's new powers were making sure no one looked forward. The 2080s belonged to men with guns and no patience. As the initial survivor camps stabilized, a new social order emerged, built entirely on violence. Raider gangs formed around charismatic psychopaths, petty warlords who understood that in a world without law, the only currency was fear. They didn't produce anything. They didn't need to. The economy ran on extortion. A settlement finds a water purifier, gets it running, starts growing crops. Within weeks, a gang arrives with an offer: 50% of everything you produce, or we burn it all and take what's left of you. Most settlements paid. The ones that refused became object lessons, their ruins serving as recruitment propaganda for the gangs and cautionary tales for everyone else. Trade routes that tried to establish themselves got hijacked until the merchants built the protection money into their prices. Caravans moved with armed escorts that cost more than the goods they protected. The raiders didn't see this as parasitic. They saw it as taxation, as their rightful cut for allowing commerce to exist at all. By 2100, the wasteland had warlords who controlled territories as large as pre-war counties, enforcing their claims through regular patrols and public executions. Any settlement that tried to build something permanent painted a target on itself. Infrastructure became a liability. Every wall you raised told raiders exactly where to find concentrated wealth. Every field you planted marked you as worth raiding. Every generator you fixed sent up smoke signals announcing your location to every gang within 20 miles. The strategic calculus was brutal. Visibility equals vulnerability, and permanence equals a standing invitation. Successful communities learned to stay mobile or stay hidden. They built in ruins that looked abandoned from the outside, used camouflage netting over their crops, kept their lights off at night. The moment you constructed something visible, such as a watchtower, or a perimeter fence, or a proper road, you advertised that you had resources worth defending and a population worth enslaving. Settlements that ignored this reality lasted months at most. The builder's tax wasn't just paid in caps or supplies. It was paid in blood, in the constant calculation of whether improving your defenses would make you safer or just make you a more attractive target. Towns that built walls found themselves under siege from gangs who saw the walls as proof of wealth inside. Farmers who cleared large fields came back from scavenging runs to find their crops burned and their families gone, sold to slavers who'd spotted the cleared land from a ridge 3 miles away. A few communities tried anyway, and their fates taught everyone else the lesson. Junktown found the middle path. Founded in 2161 by a caravan guard named Killian Darkwater, it sat behind a perimeter of rusted cars and sheet metal, defensible enough to turn back raiders, but not solid enough to look like a fortress. The construction was deliberate: corrugated scrap, visible gaps, structures that could be abandoned in 20 minutes if a real army showed up. The town had 87 permanent residents at its peak, a number Killian enforced through immigration quotas. Any bigger and you needed farmland, which meant clearing fields, which meant becoming a target. The economy ran on barter and caravan fees. Travelers paid 10 caps to sleep inside the walls, another 15 if they wanted guards watching their Brahmin. It worked because Junktown never accumulated enough to justify a coordinated attack. No granaries, no armories, no water reserves beyond a single salvage tank that held 800 gallons. When the Skulls gang tried to take over in 2161, they found a town that could pack up and vanish in an afternoon, leaving them with a pile of scrap metal and no hostages. Dozens of settlements across California copied the model, permanent enough to have a name on traders' maps, temporary enough to survive the next warlord. This was the wasteland's equilibrium, the maximum complexity the post-war world allowed. That strategy worked until the mutants arrived. The Master's army didn't raid for supplies. Starting in 2155, super mutants swept through the core region, converting humans into more super mutants, a campaign that made conventional defense irrelevant. Towns built to repel raiders found their walls climbed by 9-foot soldiers, who didn't need food or sleep and could tear through sheet metal with their hands. The Unity's expansion displaced an estimated 12,000 survivors between 2155 and 2162. Communities that had existed for 70 years scattered in weeks, their populations fragmenting into groups of 6 or 8 that moved every 3 days. Caravan routes collapsed because there were no stable endpoints. Traders arrived at coordinates to find burned foundations and week-old tracks heading east. By 2061, the Master controlled Mariposa Military Base, the Cathedral in the Boneyard, and dozens of outposts across Southern California. His army numbered at least 500 super mutants, growing by 40 per month as new subjects were dragged to the vats. The timeline showed a mathematical certainty. Within 18 months, there wouldn't be enough unconverted humans left to sustain isolated resistance. Vault-13's exile, the Vault Dweller, stopped the Master in 2162 by destroying Mariposa and revealing the sterility of supermutants, collapsing the Unity from within. The surviving mutants scattered, leaderless. Defeating the Master didn't end the pattern. It revealed something worse. After the Unity fell, 43 settlements existed within a 200-mile radius of the hub. None of them knew the others' locations. The war had destroyed every communication system. No radio network, no postal service, no shared maps. A town 60 miles north might have solved water purification, but the town south of the hub was still boiling irradiated runoff because there was no way to transmit the knowledge. Rebuilding required coordination nobody could organize. To secure a trade route, you needed 4 towns to simultaneously commit guards to patrol overlapping segments. But how do you negotiate that when messengers take 11 days round trip and might get killed by rad scorpions on the way? The hub tried in 2065, sending envoys to 8 nearby settlements with a proposal for mutual defense. 3 envoys never returned. 2 towns had been abandoned by the time the messengers arrived. 1 settlement executed the envoy, assuming it was a trick to scout their defenses. Of the 2 towns that agreed in principle, one was overrun by feral ghouls 4 months later, and the other stopped sending patrols after their caravan master died, and his successor decided the deal wasn't worth the caps. The wastes had fragmented into isolated nodes, each one solving the same problems independently, each one vulnerable to threats the next town over had already learned to defeat. Every settlement that tried to build alliances lost resources to the effort. Guards on distant patrols, food shipped to partners who might not reciprocate, trust extended to strangers who might be slavers. Even when communities wanted to ally, the wasteland had made trust impossible. Without banks or courts, wasteland commerce ran on memory. A trader who shortchanged you in Freeside might be refused service in Westside. A caravan that honored contracts got repeat business. But reputation only worked within the range you could gossip, maybe 3 or 4 settlements if the routes were safe. Every deal was a bet that the other party valued their future reputation more than the immediate payoff from screwing you over. The math was brutal. A merchant could trade honestly for years, building trust worth maybe 2,000 caps in goodwill. Or he could sell you a rifle that jams, pocket 800 caps, and disappear into the Mojave before word spread. Currency itself was suspect. Caps worked because nobody could counterfeit bottle caps at scale, but their value swung wildly between regions. NCR dollars were worthless east of the Colorado. Legion coin bought nothing in California, so every transaction required negotiation, assessment, the endless mental accounting of who owed what to whom. The wasteland had recreated the conditions that made early human trade so fragile. You couldn't build an economy on handshake deals when half the wasteland would sell you out for a stim pack. A few factions claimed they had the answer, through force. The Brotherhood of Steel emerged from the ashes with a doctrine that sounded reasonable. Preserve advanced technology. Keep it from the hands of those who'd misuse it. After all, pre-war science had already ended the world once. By 2161, they'd built a network of bunkers across California, each one a fortress monastery guarding laser rifles and power armor. But preservation became obsession. They recovered pre-war tech and locked it away. They studied old-world weapons and kept the knowledge internal. A wastelander could beg the Brotherhood to help defend against raiders, and if the elders approved, paladins would arrive in T-51B armor, obliterate the threat, then leave without teaching a single soul how to maintain a laser pistol. The Brotherhood's scribes spent decades cataloging technology they refused to share. They knew how to purify water at scale, generate electricity from fusion, manufacture ammunition. They had the library of human achievement and treated it like a family heirloom, too precious for outsiders to touch. Settlements that wanted Brotherhood protection had to offer salvage, food, recruits. The transaction was always one way. By hoarding knowledge instead of spreading it, they guaranteed no wastelander would ever compete with them, ever innovate past them, ever stop needing them. Their ideology guaranteed the wasteland would stay dependent, and that was the point. The arrangement locked in fast. A settlement under raider pressure could beg the Brotherhood for help, offer 40% of their crops as tribute, and receive a squad of paladins who'd patrol for a season. The Brotherhood provided security as a service, the way a feudal lord provided protection to serfs. You paid, you got the armor. You stopped paying, the armor left. They'd repair your generator but never explain how it worked. They'd lend you an energy weapon but take it back after the battle. A few chapters, like Lion's East Coast Contingent, broke doctrine and tried to actually help people. The wider Brotherhood declared them traitors. Sharing technology was apostasy. What emerged was a caste system with fusion cores at the top. The Brotherhood held every high-energy tool the wasteland needed to rebuild infrastructure, and they metered it out in exchange for resources and obedience. Wastelanders could scavenge, farm, and fight, but they'd never manufacture, never research, never escape the Brotherhood's technological ceiling. Some settlements accepted the bargain, others resented it. None could change it. The Brotherhood had made themselves indispensable by ensuring no one else could learn what they knew. While the Brotherhood guarded the past, another faction was trying to resurrect it wholesale. The Enclave emerged from their oil rig in 2242 with a plan older than the bombs. They'd preserved the continuity of the United States government, maintained the chain of command, kept the uniforms pressed. Their president still gave orders. Their soldiers still saluted the flag. But the America they wanted to reclaim didn't include the people living in it. The Enclave's leadership viewed wastelanders as genetically contaminated, irredeemable. Their solution was the FEV Curling 13 virus, designed to kill every mutated human on the continent. Reclamation through extermination, rebuilding by erasing the canvas first. They had working vertibirds, power armor that made the Brotherhoods look primitive, energy weapons beyond anything scavengers had seen. They had organizational discipline, manufacturing capability, a functioning chain of command, and they used it all to try starting the war over again. The Chosen One destroyed their oil rig in 2242. The remaining Enclave forces, scattered to Raven Rock and Navarro, tried again on the East Coast with Project Purity in 2277, poisoning the water to finish what Curling 13 had started. Liberty Prime crushed them a second time. Their defeat revealed a harder truth. Even the old government couldn't restart civilization. Because governance isn't flags and speeches, it's property records and birth certificates, tax rolls and land surveys, court transcripts and census data. The bombs vaporized 200 years of institutional memory in an afternoon. No one knew who owned what anymore. Pre-war deeds meant nothing when the buildings were ash. You couldn't enforce contracts when half the parties were skeletons and the other half were 3 states away. There were no judges left who remembered the law, no clerks to file the paperwork, no archives to check precedent against. Taxation requires knowing who lives where and what they earn. Law enforcement needs jails and judges, and someone to pay them. Public works need engineers and budgets, and the ability to say, "This land is condemned for the public good," without getting shot. Every function of government assumes a baseline of record-keeping and stability that simply didn't exist. The strongest settlements managed sheriffs and town councils. A few had mayors. But real institutions need more than one generation to root. They need continuity, and the wasteland kept burning down anyone who tried to plant something permanent. Without institutions, the wasteland faced its oldest enemy, itself. So people fell back on what worked before cities, before writing, before the idea that strangers 300 miles away might share your laws. They fell back on blood. By 2250, tribal structures had re-emerged across the wasteland, not as a choice, but as the only social technology that didn't require paperwork. The Whitelegs, the Sorrows, the dead horses in Zion Canyon, the Khans rebuilding themselves as a nomadic confederacy. Dozens of smaller groups, each centered on a charismatic leader and kinship bonds, each with oral histories replacing written records. The future shrank to next season's harvest, next winter's survival. Literacy dropped. Why teach reading when there were no books, no schools, no reason to write contracts no one could enforce? Skills passed parent to child, verbally, imperfectly. Each generation knew a little less than the last. Tribals in 2281 couldn't read the warning signs in pre-war ruins, couldn't parse technical manuals, couldn't maintain equipment more complex than a spear. It wasn't stupidity. It was adaptation to a world where trust stopped at your cousin, and every stranger might be a raider, where the tribe protected you, and the wasteland killed you. Simple structures for a simple calculation. A few settlements tried to break the cycle, and discovered the radiation hadn't finished its work. The radiation kept working long after the bombs stopped falling. Background rads in most regions sat between 3 and 8 millisieverts per day, roughly 1,000 times pre-war levels. Human cells repaired DNA damage at a fixed rate, and the wasteland broke strands faster than bodies could patch them. Ghouls were the visible outcome, but they were rare. Most radiation damage showed up quieter. Miscarriages at triple pre-war rates, children born with organ defects, immune systems that collapsed by age 40. The average wastelander lifespan hovered around 50 years. Pre-war Americans lived to 77. FEV, exposure, added a second layer. Anyone who drank from a water source, touched by the master's vats, or Mariposa runoff, carried low-grade mutations. Sterility spiked in certain regions, for reasons settlers couldn't see. You can't plan a 30-year construction project when half your workforce won't live to see it finished. A few communities tried selective breeding programs or quarantine zones for the visibly mutated. All of them collapsed within a generation, because you need genetic diversity to survive, and the wasteland had already shredded it. Even healthy populations hit a wall when they tried to expand. The hub's census in 2186 recorded 34 live births per 1,000 people. Pre-war California averaged 140. Infant mortality ran at 28% compared to 0.6% before the bombs. Do the math, and a settlement of 200 people gained maybe 5 adults per decade, if everything went right. That's not enough to grow. It's barely enough to replace the settlers who died to raiders, disease, or accidents. Most towns stayed locked between 50 and 300 people for generations, the population flickering up and down, but never breaking out. At that scale, everyone does a little of everything. You can't afford a full-time engineer when the engineer also needs to farm, stand watch, and haul water. Specialization requires surplus population, and the wasteland had none. The NCR's early census counted 12 doctors for 3,000 people. Pre-war California had 12 doctors per 1,000. A few settlements imported specialists from outside, paying in caps or salvage. But skilled people were rare, mobile, and expensive. Most towns made do with whoever was born there and hoped someone's kid showed an aptitude for medicine or metalwork. Labor specialization was only one of the missing pieces. The bigger problem was energy. The old world ran on oil, coal, nuclear fission, and late-stage fusion. The new world had none of it reliably. Refineries were bombed-out shells. Coal mines flooded or caved in. The solar panels that survived 200 years of weather operated at maybe 12% efficiency, if you could find intact inverters. Fusion cells and microfusion breeder reactors were scavenged, not manufactured. Nobody knew how to synthesize the fuel catalysts. A working fusion core was worth 300 caps in 2277, about 4 months' wages for a caravan guard. You burned it to power a settlement for 18 months, then went back to campfires and muscle labor. Pre-war America consumed 95 quadrillion BTUs per year. The entire post-war West Coast probably used 0.002% of that by 2260. Without energy surplus, you don't get factories. Without factories, you don't get the tools to rebuild infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you stay small, local, and pre-industrial. A few wastelanders tried hydropower or wind turbines. Most of those experiments ended when raiders realized a working generator was worth killing for. Brahmin-driven mills worked, but a Brahmin produces about 0.5 horsepower for 6 hours a day. A pre-war assembly line needed 4,000. A few locations still had power, which made them the wasteland's most fought-over territory. Hoover Dam generated 2,080 megawatts at full capacity in 2077. By 2281, the NCR kept 5 of its 17 turbines running, producing about 600 megawatts. That's enough electricity to power 500,000 pre-war homes, or in wasteland terms, to run every machine, light, and water pump in a dozen settlements. The dam sat at the center of 3 armies. The NCR held it with 700 soldiers rotated every 8 months. Caesar's Legion massed 2,400 warriors across the river. Mr. House's Securitrons patrolled the perimeter under a treaty nobody trusted. All of them needed the power. None of them could maintain the turbines without the 11 pre-war engineers the NCR flew in from Shady Sands every quarter. Those engineers were 67 years old on average. The NCR had exactly 0 engineering schools. When Turbine 3 failed in 2279, it stayed offline for 18 months because the replacement parts required a machine shop that only existed at the Boneyard, 400 miles west. By 2281, the NCR was spending $1.02 million a year defending infrastructure it barely understood and couldn't replicate. The dam story was just a preview of what would happen when someone tried to rebuild on purpose. The new California Republic formed in 2189 when 5 settlements around Shady Sands drafted a constitution. Population, 3,200. The founders had grown up in Vault 15 and remembered how civilian government worked. They held elections, established courts, and banned slavery in all member towns. By 2241, the NCR controlled 12 major towns and 700,000 citizens. They'd restored 4 pre-war water treatment plants, cleared 200 miles of highway, and run telegraph lines between settlements. Brahmin barons got rich on protected trade routes. Farmers rotated crops and used fertilizer. You could mail a letter from the hub to Reading and expect it to arrive in 11 days. The NCR Army fielded 2,000 trained soldiers with standardized weapons and radios. They crushed raider gangs, mediated disputes, and enforced contracts. In NCR territory, a merchant could plan a year ahead. Shopkeepers saved bottle caps in banks. Children went to school 4 days a week and learned to read from Salvage textbooks. Those successes came with costs the NCR didn't see until it was too late. Between 2241 and 2271, the NCR added 43 towns, expanding east into the Mojave and north past Vault City. Population hit 1.1 million. President Kimball promised citizens their children would live in a nation as great as the old America. He quadrupled the army to 8,500, built 6 new forts, and sent patrols 300 miles beyond settled territory. The supply lines couldn't keep up. An NCR trooper stationed at Camp McCarran in 2281 waited 6 weeks for ammunition, 9 weeks for rations, and 14 weeks for medical supplies. Quartermasters in New Vegas bribed caravan drivers to skip the queue. Corruption investigations sat on desks in Shady Sands for 18 months. By 2277, 40% of NCR taxes never reached the central treasury. The farms that fed the Republic needed constant irrigation from pre-war pumps. When those pumps failed, the NCR didn't have enough engineers to fix them all. Wheat yields dropped 30% between 2270 and 2278. The government bought food at inflated prices from Brahmin barons who'd lobbied for the purchases. Soldiers at forward camps ate once a day. Desertion rates hit 12%. By the time the NCR reached the Mojave, it was already collapsing from within. Back in Shady Sands, the Senate had spent 18 months debating irrigation subsidies, while Hoover Dam ran at 40% capacity. Brahmin barons held 22 of 47 Senate seats. The Office of Science and Industry hadn't approved a new water purifier design since 2270, citing safety review protocols that required forms in triplicate and sign-off from committees that met quarterly. General Oliver's promotion came through family connections to the Stockton merchant guilds, not battlefield competence. He'd never commanded more than 200 troops before taking the Mojave campaign. Colonel Shue wrote 6 memos detailing tactical failures at Camp Gulf. All 6 sat unread in a filing cabinet at McCarran. The NCR had become what Old World America feared most, a republic that could hold territory but couldn't improve it, that maintained borders but forgot why. Clerks shuffled paper, patrols walked routes. Nothing changed, nothing grew. The machinery of government hummed along, producing only more machinery. While the NCR ossified, the Mojave faced a threat it couldn't bureaucratize away. Edward Sallow had read Hegel in a follower's library tent, then watched NCR tax collectors demand 40% of a town's Brahmin herd while offering nothing but a flag and a promise. He'd seen what democracy looked like 200 years after the bombs. The conclusion wrote itself. Caesar's thesis was surgical. Technological dependence made civilizations fragile, and the wasteland killed fragile things. The Legion banned chems, stimpaks, energy weapons. Legionaries fought with machetes and threw spears because spears didn't need microfusion cells. A society built on scavenging pre-war infrastructure would collapse the moment the scrap ran out. A society built on conquest could last as long as there were enemies. He'd made 87 tribes kneel using Bronze Age tactics and absolute certainty. No elections, no committees, no debate about water rights. The twisted hairs, the ridgers, the kaibabs, all ground into a single culture in less than 30 years. Where the NCR brought bureaucracy, Caesar brought total war. Where the NCR negotiated, the Legion assimilated or exterminated. The Legion's brutal efficiency revealed the wasteland's cruelest math. The Legion's economy ran on one resource: human labor stripped of autonomy and cost. Slaves built roads, hauled water, worked forges, grew crops. No wages, no strikes, no inefficiency. Arizona highways ran safer than NCR trade routes because slaves repaired them daily under threat of crucifixion. The Legion could field armies without supply lines because slaves carried the supplies. But slavery economics had a hard requirement. Constant territorial expansion. Every slave population lost 8 to 12% annually to death, escape, or collapse. The Legion needed 3,000 to 5,000 new captives each year just to maintain current labor levels. Stop conquering, and the workforce vanished. Stop conquering, and the roads fell apart. The forges went cold. The armies starved. Lanius understood this. So did Lucius. The legate's private journals, recovered after Hoover Dam, revealed the trap. We have built a war machine that requires war to function. Peace is our extinction. The Legion had no pension system, no schools, no future beyond the next campaign. It was empire as perpetual motion, a civilization that could only grow or die. Caesar built an empire that could only exist by devouring its neighbors, and he knew it. The problem became obvious the moment Caesar's brain tumor started killing him. There was no vice president, no senate, no line of succession beyond Legate Lanius, a man whose solution to every problem involved more crucifixions. The Legion had 86 tribes under its banner, held together entirely by one man's charisma and strategic vision. When Caesar died, the whole thing would fracture. Lanius understood conquest, but not governance. The Frumentari network, the supply lines, the careful balance between assimilation and extermination, all of it depended on Caesar's personal authority. No institutions, no bureaucracy, just a cult of personality wearing Roman cosplay. The NCR at least had a framework that could survive losing a president. The Legion had a man, and when that man died, 86 tribes would remember they hated each other. Caesar's solution to the NCR's bureaucratic bloat was to build something even more fragile, a system so lean it had no redundancy at all. Both the NCR and the Legion proved the same thing. Copying the past doesn't rebuild the future. Here's what nobody invented in 200 years. New medicine, new crops, new manufacturing processes, new metallurgy, new anything. The NCR restored pre-war factories. The Brotherhood hoarded pre-war weapons. The Legion rejected technology entirely. Every major faction's strategy was archaeological, not innovative. The followers of the apocalypse came closest, actually researching new medical treatments and agricultural techniques, but they had 300 people and no army. The gunrunners manufactured ammunition using 200-year-old schematics. The Shea in San Francisco had working computers and chose isolation. The Enclave had advanced R&D and spent it building better power armor instead of water purifiers. 2 centuries, enough time for the Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, and the Information Age to happen in the Old World. In the wasteland, progress meant finding a pre-war factory that still worked. The biggest technological leap anybody made was figuring out how to keep 200-year-old robots running. A few individuals tried to change that, and the wasteland made examples of them. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology survived the war intact, 3 stories underground with functional reactors, clean water, and the brightest scientific minds in the wasteland. By 2287, they'd mastered synthetic biology, teleportation, and advanced robotics. They could have rebuilt Boston in a decade. Instead, they built synths that looked exactly like humans and sent them to the surface as infiltrators and replacements. Not aid workers, not teachers, not engineers, spies. The Institute's Synth Retention Bureau spent more resources hunting escaped synths than they ever spent helping surface communities. They had fusion power and molecular assembly. The surface had radiation storms and supermutants. Father, the Institute's director, described surface dwellers as lost, doomed, beyond saving. So the Institute stayed underground, developing technology 100 years ahead of anyone else, and used it to kidnap surface residents for experimentation. They saw themselves as humanity's future, which apparently meant watching humanity's present starve, while you perfected synthetic gorillas in a lab. The Institute had the knowledge to rebuild civilization, and chose paranoia instead. Here's what makes the Commonwealth uniquely broken. The Institute doesn't just kidnap people, it replaces them. A synth can be built to look, sound, and remember exactly like the person it copies, right down to the way they clear their throat. So when a settlement leader starts making strange decisions, nobody can be sure if it's stress, corruption, or a machine wearing their neighbor's face. That single doubt poisons everything. You can't sign a trade deal if the trader might be an Institute plant. You can't merge two settlements if half the newcomers could be reporting back underground. Diamond City, the biggest surface community in the region, once expelled its own mayor over exactly this fear, and the paranoia was justified more often than anyone wanted to admit. Every alliance becomes a possible trap, every handshake a possible setup. Cooperation is the one thing that lets small groups become civilizations, and the Institute quietly made cooperation feel like suicide. While the Institute played God, the Commonwealth's real hope was learning to play farmer. And playing farmer turns out to be the hardest job in the wasteland. 200 years after the bombs, the soil itself is still the problem. Radiation soaked into the topsoil, heavy metals settled into the groundwater, and the microscopic life that healthy dirt depends on mostly died with everything else. So crops come up stunted, twisted, or not at all. The plants that do survive, like the mutfruit and razor grain you see in every settlement, are hardy mutations that yield little and taste like punishment. Livestock fares no better. Brahmin are two-headed cattle, and the mutations that gave them a second head also gave them fragile herds that struggle to reproduce at scale. You can feed a dozen people this way, maybe 50 if the rain cooperates. What you can't do is feed the thousands packed close together that a factory town or a real city would need. A few communities cracked it anyway, coaxing steady harvests out of poisoned ground, and that's when they discovered the labor problem. Think about who actually did the work before the war. In the old world, almost nobody harvested by hand. Protectron units stocked shelves, Mr. Handys tended gardens and cooked meals, and assembly lines ran with barely a human in sight. The pre-war economy was built on the assumption that machines would carry the muscle. Then the bombs fell, and the machines mostly died with the grid that powered them. What's left is scavenged, half-broken, and irreplaceable, because nobody remembers how to build a new one. A working Mr. Handy is a small fortune, and when its fusion core runs dry, that's often the end of it. So every task falls back on human hands, and there simply aren't enough of them. Plowing, hauling, guarding, repairing, all of it competes for the same tiny pool of survivors. You can't run a farm and a workshop and a wall patrol with the same 6 people. Without automation or population, the wasteland faced a third trap: the education crisis. By 2250, most wastelanders couldn't read. The bombs didn't just kill people, they killed the infrastructure that taught them. Schools burned in the initial strikes, teachers died in the radiation, and textbooks turned to ash in the firestorms. Children born after the war learned to shoot before they learned their alphabet. A farmer in the Commonwealth might recognize 30 words, enough to read labels on cans or signs warning of danger. Anything more complex became decoration, paper for kindling, insulation for walls. Technical knowledge collapsed into oral tradition within a generation. A working water purifier became the magic box that needs the glowing rods. Engineering diagrams turned into campfire stories about the old ones who could make lightning dance. The scientific method became superstition. Troubleshooting became prayer. The literate class shrank to a handful. Brotherhood scribes hoarding holotapes, a few settlement elders who remembered school, traders who needed inventory lists. Even the literate faced a problem. There was nothing left to read. The Boston Public Library took a direct hit in 2077. The Library of Congress, already evacuated and stripped by 2076, burned for 3 weeks During the DC riots, university archives from MIT, Caltech, and West Point vanished in the initial strikes or the looting that followed. What survived faced 200 years of entropy. Paper crumbled in the humidity, ink faded in the radiation, moisture turned pages to pulp, holotapes degraded, magnetic strips demagnetized, hard drives corrupted without power to refresh them. The followers of the apocalypse catalog 47 intact pre-war books in their entire Mojave collection. Some knowledge died deliberately. The Brotherhood locked technical manuals behind steel doors, accessible only to ranked scribes. Raiders burned libraries for warmth. Religious zealots destroyed secular science as blasphemy. The Institute kept its databases secret, sharing nothing with the surface. A working fusion reactor sat in Vault 88. Its manual stored 200 feet away in a locked terminal. Nobody could access the terminal. Nobody knew the password. The reactor's builders were 170 years dead. The few surviving records revealed something the wasteland didn't want to hear. Pre-war America ran on specialization so extreme that nobody understood the full system. An electrical engineer knew power grids, but not the refineries that made transformer oil. A refinery operator knew distillation, but not the mines that produced crude. Every link in the chain assumed 12 other links were functioning. The manuals that survived reflected this. A guide to repairing a water treatment plant assumed access to replacement membranes, industrial solvents, and calibrated pressure gauges. It assumed a functioning supply chain, standardized parts, and workers who'd completed vocational training. It assumed a world that no longer existed. Wastelanders found themselves holding instructions for systems they couldn't possibly rebuild. A holotape on agricultural optimization required soil testing equipment, chemical fertilizers, and hybrid seed genetics. All gone. A robotics manual started with the sentence, "Before beginning repairs, consult your Robco-certified technician." There were no certified technicians. There was no Robco. The irony cut deep. The old world had documented everything, backed it up, stored it in climate-controlled archives. They'd made knowledge more accessible than any civilization in history. But they'd made it accessible within a context that assumed itself eternal. The manuals that survived told people how to maintain the old world, not create a new one. So when the survivors started building, they didn't ask what kind of society the wasteland could support. They asked how fast they could get back to 2077. The Enclave wanted to restore the United States government, complete with the same bureaucratic structure that had incinerated the world. The Brotherhood of Steel hoarded technology like monks preserving scripture, waiting for civilization to rise high enough to deserve it again. The NCR went furthest, actually recreating a functioning republic with taxes and elections and a bloated Senate. But even they measured success by how closely they matched pre-war America, not by whether their system actually worked in a world of rad scorpions and super mutants. Every cap spent on printing paper currency was a cap not spent on developing water purification that didn't need pre-war parts. Vault-Tec had sold America a vision of continuity, of waiting underground until the surface was ready to be America again. The vaults that opened found a world that would never be ready, but the dream stuck. 2 centuries later, factions were still trying to resurrect a corpse instead of building something new from the bones. That nostalgia blinded everyone to what the wasteland had actually become. Because the wasteland wasn't just a damaged version of the old world, it was a different planet wearing Earth's geography. The bees were gone, the beetles were gone. Most of the insects that had pollinated crops and decomposed waste had been cooked out of existence in the first 72 hours, and nothing had evolved to replace them in time. What survived had mutated into something else entirely. Radroaches the size of dogs, blood bugs that hunted in swarms, mirrorlurks colonizing every coastal ruin, building colonies in the wreckage of human cities like hermit crabs in borrowed shells. The food chains that remained were broken at random links, invasive species filling niches that had never existed before the bombs. Humans could grow crops, barely, in irradiated soil, with mutated seeds and constant vigilance against blights that hadn't existed in 2077. But the yields were a fraction of pre-war harvests. The Brahmin that provided meat and leather were mutated cattle, sterile and dependent on human breeding programs to survive. Every calorie required more labor than it had before the war, and every failed harvest pushed communities closer to raiding their neighbors instead of trading. This wasn't a world healing from a wound. This was a new equilibrium, a post-nuclear ecology, as alien to 2077 as the Cambrian explosion would have been to the dinosaurs. Adapting to that ecology would mean becoming something other than human. The ghouls had already crossed that line. Radiation didn't kill them anymore. It sustained them, rewrote them, kept their cells dividing long past the point where a normal human would have collapsed into cancer. Some had been alive since before the bombs fell. They remembered cars that ran, cities that worked, a world where you could drink water from a tap without checking it for rads. That made them invaluable, in theory. Living libraries with 200 years of continuous memory, witnesses to every mistake the wasteland had made. But smooth-skinned settlements didn't want their advice. They wanted them gone. Ghouls reminded people too much of what the bombs had done, what radiation could still do. Towns that tolerated them kept them in the basement or the outskirts, never in positions of leadership. And the ghouls knew their clock was ticking in a different way. They didn't age, but they degraded. Cognitive function slipping year by year, memories blurring. The risk of going feral, always one bad day of radiation exposure away. Most ferals had been people once, ghouls who'd lost themselves to the same condition that kept them alive. The ones who stayed lucid, watched their friends turn into shambling monsters, and knew they might be next. So they kept to themselves, formed their own communities, in places too irradiated for smooth skins to settle. They'd tried helping in the early years, offering their knowledge, their skills. But after watching 8 or 10 human settlements collapse into the same patterns of violence and failure, most just stopped trying. The wasteland's longest survivors had seen every rebuilding effort fail, and they knew why. The ghouls remembered how the pre-war electrical grid worked, which federal agencies had collapsed first, and exactly why the Sino-American resource wars had made reconstruction impossible even before the bombs. They'd watched the Enclave try to rebuild a centralized government in the 2240s, using the same command structure that failed in 2077. They'd seen the Brotherhood hoard technology the same way pre-war corporations had, with the same results. A ghoul trader in the hub could explain why pre-war supply chains required 47 different regulatory bodies, none of which existed anymore. Another in Rivet City remembered the specific congressional bill that had defunded infrastructure maintenance in 2076, leaving the roads to crumble a year before the nukes finished the job. But when they offered this context, wastelanders heard old stories, not blueprints. The wasteland preferred its myths. The Enclave became monsters in folklore, not a cautionary tale about centralized power. The Brotherhood became tech-hoarding villains, not an example of what happens when you classify survival knowledge. Ghouls had 200 years of institutional memory, explaining why every rebuild followed the same path to failure, and the wasteland treated them like crazy uncles at Thanksgiving. Ignoring history meant repeating the same mistakes, starting with centralization. Every attempt to establish a capital city in the wasteland ended the same way. The Enclave picked the ruins of Washington, D.C. for its symbolic weight and spent 30 years fighting super mutants, Brotherhood paladins, and their own internal purges. The NCR declared Shady Sands its capital in 2189 and immediately became a target for every raider gang and rival faction within 500 miles. New Vegas should have been perfect. Intact infrastructure, working power, defensible position. But Mr. House's centralized control attracted the Legion from the east, the NCR from the west, and 6 different schemes to take the dam. Boston's Institute controlled the Commonwealth from underground and triggered a surface war that killed thousands. Centralized power was a beacon, and in the wasteland, beacons drew fire. By 2287, the pattern was clear. Declare a capital. Attract every faction with an army. Try to hold it. Burn through resources. Lose it, or win and inherit ruins that cost more to defend than they're worth. The hub avoided calling itself a capital and survived 160 years through distributed leadership. Good Neighbor stayed small and irrelevant, which meant it stayed standing. Decentralization might avoid the war, but it created a different trap. The NCR minted gold coins, backed by reserves in shady sands. The hub used water as currency. The Commonwealth ran on bottle caps, while the capital wasteland used pre-war money until merchants realized it was worthless. A Brahmin cost 250 caps in Boston, 80 NCR dollars in California, or 15 gallons of purified water in the Mojave, and none of those systems talked to each other. Laws fractured the same way. The NCR copied pre-war California's legal code, which referenced federal statutes that no longer existed. Diamond City ran on mayoral decree. Megaton's sheriff enforced whatever kept the bomb from detonating. A murder in one settlement was justice in another, self-defense in a third. Traders crossing regional borders needed to know 12 different legal systems, none written down. Measurements drifted apart. The Institute used metric. The Brotherhood used imperial. Most settlements eyeballed it and called close enough good enough. A caravan manifest listing 50 kilos of grain meant nothing to a hub merchant counting in pounds, and the conversion math had died with the calculators. Trade required translators, middlemen, and trust nobody had. Every exchange bled value to friction. Without standards, the wasteland stayed fractured, and fractures made perfect hiding places. The knowledge was out there, buried in reinforced bunkers, locked behind lead doors, guarded by automated turrets that never sleep. Big MT sat in the Mojave like a tomb of genius, its think tank still running experiments 200 years after their brains were placed in jars. The scientists there had mastered biological engineering, energy weapons, and stealth technology that could render entire armies obsolete. The Glow was once West-Tech's most advanced research facility, home to the Forced Evolutionary Virus program. After the bombs fell, it became the most irradiated spot in California, lethal to anyone without power armor and Rad-X measured in pounds. Every terminal inside held schematics for pre-war weapons systems. Every sample cabinet contained biological agents that could reshape humanity. Mariposa Military Base housed FEV production, vats large enough to dip a human body, records of every test subject and mutation. The Master found it in 2002 and used it to create his super mutant army. The Enclave found it later and planned something worse. Both times, the facility nearly ended the wasteland's fragile recovery. These sites weren't hidden by accident. They were designed to keep secrets, built with security protocols that assumed foreign invasion, not societal collapse. The wastelanders who found those sites learned that some knowledge comes with costs. FEV could cure disease, extend lifespans, and create humans resistant to radiation. It could also turn people into mindless super mutants, centaurs, or things without names. The Master's attempt to unify humanity through forced evolution ended when he discovered FEV-mutated humans were sterile. His entire vision collapsed in a single conversation. The Garden of Eden creation kit was supposed to rebuild the world in weeks. Vault-8 used theirs in 2091 and founded Vault City, a clean water paradise with electricity and medical care. But Gex required trained operators, stable ground, and resources most vaults never had. Misuse could terraform an area into something unlivable, or detonate with the force of a tactical nuke. Liberty Prime was a 40-foot anti-communist robot that threw nuclear footballs. The Archimedes One-Eye satellite could call down solar death from orbit. X-01 power armor made its wearer nearly invincible. Each invention shortened the path to stability and lengthened the path to extinction. Using pre-war superscience meant inheriting pre-war problems, the kind that had already ended the world once. Every faction that grabbed for those tools risked becoming the next apocalypse. The safest path forward was the slowest, and the wasteland doesn't reward patience. A settlement needs walls before winter. Raiders hit every harvest season, so crops have to yield before September, or the work is wasted. You can spend 3 months building a loom, or you can trade 40 caps for pre-war cloth that'll last 2 years. The math is simple, and it's killing you. Salvage economics spread like infection. Megaton was built around an undetonated bomb because the scrap was already there. Rivet City squatted in an aircraft carrier because building from scratch would take a generation. Every settlement that chose salvage over production stayed dependent on the ruins, and the ruins were finite. The cycle locked in fast. Quick results kept people alive through the next threat, so quick results became doctrine. Production requires surplus, time, and safety. Salvage requires a crowbar. When the difference is survival, you take the crowbar every time, and 200 years later, you're still searching the same bombed-out Walmart for duct tape. Growing out of that trap meant planting crops you wouldn't harvest, training apprentices who wouldn't master their trade for years, investing in infrastructure that wouldn't pay off until your grandchildren inherited it. Breaking that cycle would require something the wasteland had lost: long-term thinking. The average wastelander who survived childhood made it to maybe 45. Raiders, radiation sickness, infected wounds, starvation during bad harvests. In the Mojave, a Brahmin rancher might teach his daughter how to mend fences and rotate pastures, but she'd be lucky to pass that knowledge to her own kids before a fiend raid or a Cazadori nest ended the line. Pre-war America had universities, apprenticeships that lasted years, retirement plans. The wasteland had oral tradition, and whoever happened to survive long enough to remember how Grandpa jury-rigged the water pump. When that person died of dysentery at 38, the settlement spent 6 months figuring it out again from scratch. You see it in the terminals. A caravan master in 2241 logs a safe route through the divide, marks the water sources, names the landmarks. By 2255, everyone who knew that route is dead, and a new caravan loses 11 people relearning it. No maps survived, no institutional memory, just fresh corpses teaching the same lesson. Communities that should have compounded their knowledge instead reset every 20 years. Each generation started from zero, rediscovered fire, reinvented the wheel. Nobody planned past their own lifespan, because planning required believing your children would live long enough to see it through. Even settlements that survived for decades hit the same wall: succession. Shady Sands had Aradesh, a founder who held 36 families together through intelligence and sheer force of will. When he died, the town nearly fractured, until Tandy stepped up. She ruled for 52 years and turned a farming village into the new California Republic. When she finally passed in 2248, the NCR had a government, a constitution, an army. It survived her. Most settlements didn't get a Tandy. They got a tough ex-raider who fortified a gas station, kept 40 people alive for 8 years, then caught a bullet during a supply run. His second-in-command didn't have the respect, couldn't hold the factions together. Within 3 months, half the population scattered. Within 6, the raiders moved back in. The wasteland was littered with towns named after dead founders. Megaton had Manya Vargas remembering when it was just wreckage and a bomb. Rivet City had Horace Pinkerton before the coup. Canterbury Commons had Uncle Rowe, keeping 12 traders operating on handshake deals. Every one of them a single point of failure, one infection, or one bad fall from total collapse. You couldn't build systems when systems required trusting strangers to carry them forward. The pre-war world ran on institutions, on bureaucracies that nobody loved but everybody relied on because they'd outlast any individual. The wasteland ran on strongmen and the hope they'd live long enough. Trust issues went deeper than leadership, though. They were built into the wasteland's DNA. Vault-Tec didn't just shelter people from the bombs. They engineered specific psychological conditions, ran controlled experiments on captive populations for 200 years. Vault 11 made residents sacrifice one person annually, or everyone dies. Vault 12's door never sealed, flooding necropolis with radiation. Vault 101 never opened, breeding xenophobia into 6 generations. When those vaults finally failed, when the descendants spilled into the wasteland, they carried their traumas with them. The Vault 101 dwellers who'd shot their own neighbors for trying to leave. The Vault 77 survivor who'd spent years alone with a crate of puppets and lost his grip on what people were for. Vault 22's spore carriers who didn't know they were contagious. This wasn't random. Vault-Tec had hypotheses. They wanted to know if humans could be reshaped, if you could breed out cooperation, if isolation produced better colonists, or just better killers. The data mattered more than the subjects. Every vault was a petri dish, and the agar was human nature, stressed until it broke in quantifiable ways. So the wasteland inherited populations preconditioned to distrust democracy, fear outsiders, solve problems with violence, hoard resources, believe every neighbor might be the enemy. Not because the bombs made people that way, because Vault-Tec spent 2 centuries making sure they would be. That distrust wasn't accidental. It was the experiment's point. Vault 11's computer demanded an annual sacrifice. One overseer, every year, murdered by democratic vote. The survivors who finally refused the order discovered the terminal's congratulations message, praising them for valuing human life. 4 people walked out. They shot each other in the months that followed. Vault 19 split its residents into red and blue sectors, fed them paranoia through loudspeakers, convinced each side the other was an enemy. When the doors opened, they couldn't cooperate long enough to share a water pump. Vault 101 kept its door sealed for 200 years, taught every generation that the outside world was certain death, that strangers carried plague. The overseer's daughter leaves, meets wasteland traders, comes back with medicine and seeds. Her father exiles her. 3 families follow. The rest stay locked inside, and the settlement they could have built never forms. Vault 22 gave its inhabitants aggressive spore infection. Vault 92 used white noise to trigger homicidal rage. Vault 106 pumped hallucinogens through the ventilation on day 4. These weren't accidents or budget cuts. Each vault was a deliberate injection of dysfunction, a calculated wound that wouldn't heal. Every vault that opened released not just survivors, but social sabotage. 17. Control vaults operated as designed. Clean water, no experiments. Functional government. Vault 8 became Vault City by 2241, 164 years ahead of schedule. They had hydroponics, medical clinics, enforced citizenship laws. Vault 13 sent out the Vault Dweller, who founded Arroyo, which survived 80 years as a tribal federation. Vault 76 in Appalachia opened on Reclamation Day, 2102, with every resource a civilization needs. 25 years later, the region had trading posts, farms, functional infrastructure. Then the scorch beasts came, then the blood eagles, then the settlers and raiders, fought a three-way war over a single gold bullion reserve. Vault City's Senate refused to share agricultural tech with surrounding farmers, afraid of losing trade leverage. Arroyo stayed isolated in a canyon, couldn't defend its borders when the Enclave arrived. Vault 76's dwellers scattered into factions, fought over the same resources they could have pooled. The control vaults proved you could restart society with the right equipment and training. What they couldn't solve was what happens in year 30, when the next generation asks why they should share. Even the best-case scenarios failed to spread, because success bred envy. Vault City's caravans got raided 6 times in 2242 alone, not by desperate scavengers, by organized slaver guilds who saw prosperity and wanted a cut. The hub controlled 9 trade routes in 2161 and faced constant extortion from the Khans, the Vipers, local water barons. Defense costs consumed 40% of merchant profits. Rivet City in the capital wasteland built a working desalination plant, grew real vegetables under UV lamps, maintained a council government. Within 2 years, super mutants besieged the carrier weekly. Talon Company mercs camped the bridge. Refugees showed up in waves, each one straining food supplies. The council couldn't expand fast enough. The settlement at Greentop Nursery kept their crops low, traded quietly, never built walls higher than 6 feet. Finch Farm did the same, stayed small, stayed unnoticed. Bunker Hill grew into a trading hub and immediately became a battlefield between the Institute, the Railroad, and the Brotherhood, none of whom cared about the civilian population caught between them. Progress attracted predators faster than it attracted allies. Towns that thrived became targets. Towns that struggled were left alone. The math was brutal and consistent. A few settlements tried to hide their success and discovered isolation has its own price. The choice was impossible from the start. Open your gates, trade with neighbors, share your water purifier, and eventually someone stronger notices. Close your gates, hoard everything, and you're just buying time until your generator fails and nobody remembers how to fix it. Vault City picked isolation. They had pre-war tech, working infrastructure, and a 2-century head start on everyone else. They refused to train outsiders, wouldn't share medical knowledge, and treated every neighbor like a contamination risk. By 2241, they were a museum piece, politically irrelevant, surrounded by the NCR's expanding trade network. The NCR tried the opposite. They absorbed everyone, shared everything, built schools and trained farmers across 5 states. By 2277, they were overstretched, bureaucratically paralyzed, losing territory faster than they could garrison it. Every settlement they uplifted became another logistical liability they couldn't afford to lose. No strategic choice worked, because the wasteland's real problem wasn't strategy. It was belief. 2 centuries of watching everything collapse teaches a specific lesson. Your grandfather rebuilt a town. Raiders burned it. Your mother fixed the irrigation. A radstorm poisoned the crops. You spent 6 months scavenging parts for a generator, and it failed in a year because nobody documented the maintenance schedule. By 2287, the wasteland had developed a working philosophy. Don't build anything you'll miss when it's gone. Settlements stayed small because small meant disposable. Nobody invested in roads or bridges because the next super mutant migration would wreck them anyway. The phrase "good enough" became the highest engineering standard anyone remembered. It wasn't laziness, it was pattern recognition. Every attempt at permanence had failed for 200 years. Building became the wasteland's version of superstition, something naive people did before they learned better. The children of builders became scavengers because scavenging worked and building didn't. That hopelessness was rational until you looked at what people actually did with their time. Wastelanders didn't lack energy. They spent it on everything except infrastructure. Raiders crafted elaborate armor from scrap, painting symbols and welding spikes for 40 hours, when a simple metal plate would stop bullets just as well. Settlers arranged tin cans into decorative patterns, built neon signs for bars, organized grognak costume contests. The Nuka-Cola obsession alone proves the point. People crossed irradiated zones to collect specific flavors, maintained pristine vending machines in their settlements, traded weapons for empty bottles. One man in the capital wasteland spent 30 years assembling a complete quantum collection while his roof leaked and his walls had bullet holes. Gunners maintained parade ground discipline and unit insignia. Atom Cats polished power armor to a mirror finish. The triggermen wore suits in 110-degree heat because style mattered more than comfort. Settlements built statues, painted murals, threw festivals. They found time for revenge plots that took months to execute. They had the resources to rebuild. They just didn't have the reason. The settlers of Megaton built their homes inside a bomb crater, circling the unexploded warhead like it was a campfire. They could have moved 200 meters in any direction and started fresh. Instead, they salvaged aircraft parts, riveted them into walls, and made the bomb their town square. The ruins weren't just shelter. They were proof you came from somewhere, that the world existed before you were born into it. Every pre-war sign, every faded advertisement, every crumbling overpass said the same thing. People lived here once, and maybe that means you can too. Clearing the rubble meant erasing that continuity. Building new meant admitting the old world was gone for good. So they patched instead of rebuilt, scavenged instead of manufactured, and turned wreckage into identity. The past became the only story worth telling because the present had no narrative arc. Wastelanders decorated with pre-war kitsch named their settlements after old-world places and fought over buildings that had stopped being structurally sound 150 years ago. The ruins served one more function. They hid the real answer in plain sight. Good Neighbor let ghouls and drifters walk through the gates without a cap to their name. The followers of the apocalypse taught reading and medicine for free in the old Mormon fort. Rivet City pooled hydroponics yields and maintained a working council where every resident got a vote. These places lasted, not because they had the most guns or the highest walls, but because they built systems where cooperation paid better than betrayal. Good Neighbor's tolerance meant more traders. The followers' education meant fewer deaths from infected wounds. Rivet City's resource sharing meant no one starved when one crop failed. The pattern repeated across the wasteland in a dozen small settlements that never made it into history books. 30 people sharing a water pump and a Brahmin herd. 50 residents rotating guard duty and splitting caravan profits. Systems so obvious they seemed inevitable until you noticed how rare they were. Canterbury Commons mediated disputes between traders. Erifu negotiated with vampires instead of fighting them. The Republic of Dave collapsed every election cycle, but 6 people rebuilding it every time still counted as functional government. Those systems never scaled because the wasteland didn't want them to. Rivet City worked beautifully at 40 residents. At 100, the council meetings turned into shouting matches over who deserved the 3rd hydroponics level. Security needed hierarchies. Hierarchies needed commanders. And commanders started making decisions without votes. The carrier had 4 decks, and by year 3, the upper levels stopped talking to the lower ones. Good Neighbor's open-door policy held until the population hit critical mass and the triggermen moved in. Hancock couldn't police everyone, so he picked favorites. Tolerance became selective. The ghouls who'd built the place got pushed to the edges by humans with caps to spend. Growth attracted attention. A settlement of 30 wasn't worth raiding. Too much effort, for too little loot. A settlement of 200 meant stockpiled food, clean water, ammunition, and slaves. Every successful expansion painted a target on the map. Raiders aren't stupid. They wait for you to do the work. Then they take it. The settlements that survived stayed small, deliberately. They turned away new residents, rationed membership, and watched larger neighbors collapse under their own weight. Scaling up meant scaling the wrong things: bureaucracy, inequality, and the number of people who wanted to be in charge. Every solution hit the same ceiling until someone asked a different question. For 200 years, every faction from the NCR to the Brotherhood asked the same question: how do we rebuild? How do we get the factories running, the farms organized, the government back online? But nobody stopped to ask whether rebuilding was actually the right move. Pre-war civilization built 400,000 nuclear warheads, turned the planet into a corporate feudalism nightmare, and then launched everything at once because a calculator told them to. That's the society everyone's trying to recreate, the one that ended the world. The Enclave wanted to restore America. They chose genocide. The Institute wanted to restore science. They chose slavery. The Brotherhood wanted to restore order. They chose hoarding technology and letting farmers starve 6 miles from their bunkers. Maybe the wasteland wasn't broken. Maybe it was just done pretending the old world deserved a sequel. A few communities had already figured that out and built something else. Arafu never tried to become a city. 8 families living on a collapsed highway overpass, sharing Brahman and water, rotating guard duty. No mayor, no laws written down, just agreements that changed when the situation did. Population stayed under 20 for 40 years. Canterbury Commons ran a caravan network across 4 settlements with 0 permanent infrastructure. No roads to maintain, no telegraph lines to defend, just traders who knew the routes and agreements that expired every season. When one caravan master died, the network rerouted in 3 days. Novak built a trade hub inside a pre-war motel with 12 rooms and 1 sniper nest. They didn't farm, didn't manufacture, didn't govern anyone. Travelers paid in caps or supplies for a safe bed and clean water. Overhead costs: 1 sniper, 1 clerk, and however much ammunition it took to keep raiders guessing. These places didn't look like civilization to NCR cartographers or Brotherhood scribes. No grid layouts, no tax records, no chain of command past Ask Joel, he usually knows. But they worked for decades while their neighbors collapsed, trying to operate schools and legislatures with 11 literate people. Adaptation wasn't just survival. It was the answer the wasteland had been giving all along. Radiation doesn't stop at the first generation. A rad roach exposed to 340 rads doesn't just mutate. It passes unstable DNA to offspring that are born more sensitive to the background radiation their parent created. That second generation sheds more contaminated tissue, which increases ambient rads in their nest by another 15 to 20%, which hits the third generation even harder. It's a ratchet. Each turn makes the next turn easier. Bloatflies that fed on irradiated corpses 100 years ago are now breeding cycles that produce larvae 6 times faster than pre-war specimens. But each larva is less viable. More mutations, more failures, more radioactive biomass rotting in the soil. The wasteland isn't stabilizing, it's accelerating. Every mutated creature that dies and decays adds another isotope cocktail to the groundwater. Every nest, every corpse, every failed mutation is fuel for the next generation's deterioration. Mathematics say the baseline radiation in downtown DC should be dropping by now, but instead, it's climbing 0.8% per year. Humans can pack up and move when an area gets too hot. Radroaches, mole rats, and mirrorlurks can't. They're locked in, generation after generation, riding the ratchet down. But some creatures found a way to turn that ratchet in their favor. Deathclaws didn't just survive the radiation, they thrived in it. Every generation faster, stronger, smarter than the last. Same story with rad scorpions the size of Brahmin, cazadores that hunt in coordinated packs. The pattern showed up in every region. A settlement clears 5 square miles, plants crops, builds walls. The predators notice. Food density goes up, so does breeding. Within 18 months, the perimeter's swarming with threats the original guards never trained for. Shady Sands pushed east in 2186 and triggered a Deathclaw population explosion that cost them 140 people before they pulled back. The hub tried to secure trade routes to Necropolis in 2192. Rad scorpion nests quadrupled in the corridor within a year. Expansion didn't just attract predators. It fed them, bred them, made them better. Human settlements grew linearly. Wasteland apex predators grew exponentially, which meant that safety itself became the enemy of progress. Because here's what happened when a town actually achieved security. The veterans who cleared the land got older. The kids who grew up inside walls never learned to spot a trapdoor spider nest or read rad scorpion burrow patterns in the sand. Rivet City went 11 years without a serious external threat between 2266 and 2277. Their security force turned into a jobs program. When they tried to expand scavenging operations into deeper DC ruins in 2277, they lost 6 people in the first week to threats their grandfathers would have handled on instinct. Megaton stayed safe behind its crater walls for decades, comfortable. When Lucas Sims tried to organize salvage runs to Springvale Elementary in 2277, he couldn't find 10 people under 40 who knew how to move through raider territory without getting flanked. Safety didn't preserve capability, it eroded it. Every generation that didn't have to fight forgot how. And the moment they needed to push outward again, to grow, to build something bigger, the wasteland killed them for going soft. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the one place that should have had every advantage. Vault City opened in 2241 with everything. Working GECK technology, clean water, functional medtech, a population that could read. They should have become the capital of New California. Instead, they became the wasteland's worst neighbor. They called outsiders servants, forced them into indentured contracts for basic medical care, refused to trade GECK water purification tech even when surrounding villages were dying of cholera. When Gecko's reactor started leaking in 2241, Vault City's council saw it as an opportunity to annex them, not a crisis to solve together. By 2242, every caravan route avoided them. The NCR wouldn't formalize relations. Even the Bishop family in New Reno, actual mobsters, considered Vault City too poisonous to partner with long-term. They had the resources to rebuild civilization for 500 square miles. They chose to hoard them behind a chain-link fence and wonder why nobody wanted to join. All the technology in the world couldn't fix what their isolation had done to them. They proved that you could have everything and still build nothing, because cruelty is more contagious than generosity. Their cruelty revealed something even darker about what the vaults were actually for. Here's the part that sits wrong once you notice it. Vault-Tec never sold survival. They sold the idea of survival, while running a completely different question underneath. And that question wasn't whether people would live. It was whether people could ever come back together afterward, and whether they even should. Look at the designs, and the pattern gets hard to unsee. A vault with one working ticket for a life outside. A vault flooded with paranoia by a rigged election. A vault split into rich and poor to watch resentment do the rest. None of these were built to produce a functioning community. They were built to measure exactly how a community breaks, and how fast. The Great War was the excuse, but the wasteland was always the laboratory. Vault-Tec wanted to know if humanity, stripped of comfort and trust, would rebuild on its own or tear itself apart trying. And the experiments were tuned to answer that by pushing people toward the second outcome, which meant the one resource everyone needed was the one resource Vault-Tec made sure would never exist. That resource was trust. Not weapons, not clean water, not caps. Trust, the quiet assumption that the person beside you won't sell you out when things get tight. Every large project a society builds, from a farm to a town to a government, rests on strangers, believing strangers will keep their word. And nearly every Vault experiment was calibrated to poison exactly that belief. Vault 11 told its people they had to murder one of their own every year, or everyone would die. It was a lie, but it worked, and it turned neighbors into voters, deciding who got sacrificed. Vault 77 locked a single man in, with nothing but a crate of puppets, until he lost the thread of what other people even were. Different methods, same target, and the target was never the body. When you teach people that cooperation gets you killed and isolation is the only safe state, you don't just traumatize one generation. You break the wiring that lets groups coordinate at scale, the thing that turns survivors into settlers. Vault-Tec understood that a population too suspicious to organize can never rebuild, and that mistrust became hereditary. Not in the genes. There's no paranoia chromosome passed down in the wasteland. It moves the way it always has, through parenting, through the 1,000 small lessons a frightened adult teaches a child without ever meaning to. A raider's kid learns that taking comes before asking. A Vault survivor's kid learns that the door stays locked for a reason. Picture a mother who watched her settlement burn, teaching her daughter to check every stranger's hands for a weapon. She's not cruel. She's loving, and she's trying to keep her child alive with the only knowledge she has, which is that the world takes and takes, but the lesson lands as a rule for life. Trust no one, assume the worst, get them before they get you. So the horror the Vaults engineered outlives the people who suffered it. Zero-sum thinking becomes the family inheritance, handed down at the dinner table and around the campfire, generation after generation, long after anyone remembers why. It's a sad kind of tragedy, ordinary parents passing on wounds they never chose. But one group managed to break the cycle, at least temporarily. West Virginia's responders were emergency workers who walked straight out of the fire stations and hospitals where they'd been hiding and got back to work. Within weeks of the bombs falling, they'd organized medical clinics in Flatwoods, set up training courses for new volunteers, and started distributing food and clean water across Appalachia. They built the kind of infrastructure everyone claims they want in the wasteland. Schools teaching basic literacy and first aid, firehouses coordinated by radio, a functioning airport distributing supplies by air. For 5 years, they held the region together, while everyone else was still learning to scavenge. Then the scorched plague arrived in 2082, and every hospital became an infection vector. Every gathering point where the responders had taught people to seek help turned into a mass casualty site. The clinics that made them heroes made them targets, and the infected poured in like moths to a flame. By 2096, the entire organization was gone, not defeated in battle, not conquered by raiders, wiped out because healing people meant concentrating the vulnerable in one place, and concentrated vulnerability attracts every threat in a 50-mile radius. Their extinction taught the wasteland a lesson it never forgot. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. Build a school and hungry settlers show up at your door. Establish a clinic, and suddenly you're responsible for treating radiation sickness you can't cure with supplies you don't have. Start teaching agriculture, and you've painted a target on your crops that every raider gang within walking distance can see. It's a perverse selection pressure. The wastelanders who survive longest are the ones who help nobody, teach nothing, and keep their resources hidden. The ones who try to build something larger get mobbed by desperate people they can't feed, then picked clean by opportunists who waited for the crowd to gather. Good Springs survives because it's small and quiet. Rivet City endures because it's a fortress that can close its gates. But open your doors, offer genuine help, and you've just volunteered to absorb every refugee crisis and raider problem in the region until the sheer weight of other people's emergencies crushes you flat. The Commonwealth remembers this math. Every farmer who's watched a clinic get overrun, every merchant who's seen a charity become a bandit target. The wasteland doesn't punish greed half as reliably as it punishes generosity, which explains why the one faction that should have rebuilt everything never even tried. The Minutemen had everything the responders lacked. No central headquarters to destroy, no concentrated resources to loot, just armed settlers in each community, coordinating by radio, responding to threats as a militia, and dispersing when the crisis passed. For decades, it worked beautifully. But radical decentralization meant no one could force anyone to do anything. When two settlements had a border dispute, there was no Minutemen court to arbitrate. When one captain decided his people deserved a bigger share of trade revenue, there was no hierarchy to overrule him. Every conflict became a negotiation, and every negotiation risked splitting the coalition. The Quincy Massacre in 2287 wasn't their first crisis. It was just the one where enough people said no that the whole structure collapsed. Captain Baker called for reinforcements, and most settlements looked at the odds, looked at their own walls, and decided Quincy wasn't their problem. No one could order them to march. No one could punish desertion, because desertion wasn't even a concept. By the time the sole survivor arrives, the Minutemen are down to one man, hiding in a museum, surrounded by raiders. The faction with the most popular support, the fairest structure, the genuine moral authority, destroyed not by external enemies, but by the simple math that voluntary cooperation stops working the moment someone decides their family matters more than yours. Their failure revealed the one thing every successful faction secretly understood. The Brotherhood of Steel didn't ask settlements for permission to patrol their territory. The NCR didn't hold town meetings before executing raiders. Caesar's Legion didn't negotiate with rival warlords. They killed them. Every faction that survived past 50 people did it the same way. Concentrate all legitimate violence in one organization, then use that monopoly to suppress anyone else trying to build an army. The Minutemen tried distributed defense, where every settlement kept its own militia and called for backup when needed. It lasted 11 years before a coordinated raider assault at Quincy proved that 15 settlements each, contributing 3 defenders, will always lose to 45 raiders moving as one unit. Decentralized violence doesn't scale. It just creates 15 small targets instead of one hard one. The NCR learned this in the Mojave, when local sheriffs kept cutting deals with powder gangers to avoid confrontation. The Brotherhood learned it when regional elders started hoarding technology instead of sharing intelligence. Distributed authority over violence is just warlordism with a charter. The wasteland respects one law: whoever can inflict the most organized harm wins. But centralized violence required one resource the wasteland could never reliably produce. Trained soldiers are easy. Give someone a rifle, teach them to follow orders, send them on patrol. The NCR drafted 700,000 troops over 40 years. Caesar's Legion enslaved entire tribes into frontline units. The Brotherhood recruited continuously from wastelanders who wanted power armor and 3 meals a day. The shortage was never bodies. It was sergeants, captains, field commanders who could read a tactical situation and make the call without waiting for orders from headquarters 90 miles away. You can't train that. It comes from surviving 47 firefights and learning that the raider camp intel was wrong. The supply line got cut and your radio died 6 hours ago. Most people with that experience are dead. The ones who survived either went rogue as warlords or burned out from stress injuries. The wasteland has no psychiatrists to treat. Elder Lyons spent 19 years building the Capital Wasteland chapter into a functional army, then watched it fracture the moment he tried to delegate authority to subordinates, who immediately started questioning orders. The NCR's Mojave campaign collapsed into infighting between Colonel Moore and Ambassador Crocker, because nobody above them could make the 8-day trip to adjudicate. Caesar's Legion worked only because Caesar personally adjudicated every major decision, which meant the entire empire ran at the speed of one man's cognitive bandwidth, which meant the few good leaders that emerged faced an impossible choice. President Kimball knew exactly who'd succeed him if he died. Oliver, the general who thought throwing more bodies at Hoover Dam counted as strategy. Elder Maxon knew his likely successors were either zealots who'd purge wastelanders or pragmatists who'd compromise the codex into irrelevance. Robert House ran New Vegas for 200 years because every potential successor he met would have turned it into either a dictatorship or a looted ruin within 10 years. So they didn't train successors. They hoarded authority, bottlenecked decisions, refused to distribute power to anyone who might use it differently. Kimball micromanaged military policy from shady sands. Maxon centralized all major decisions through his personal approval. House didn't even tell his lieutenants the full plan. It kept their systems running, but guaranteed those systems would die with them. Elder Lyon's death triggered an immediate coup that reversed his entire legacy. The NCR's Ranger commanders are all 60+ because everyone competent enough to replace them already left for private security work that pays better and doesn't require sleeping in a tent. Caesar's brain tumor meant the Legion was one aneurysm away from civil war between Lanius and Vulpes, neither of whom understood the economic system holding the empire together. Every faction that achieved scale did it by concentrating power in one capable leader, who then became the single point of failure. And even if they solved succession, they'd still run into the one wall no faction has ever climbed. The NCR held elections, but everyone knew the Brahmin barons bought the votes. The Brotherhood claimed they were preserving technology for humanity's benefit, but their bunkers stayed sealed. The Institute said they were mankind's best hope, while kidnapping surface dwellers for experiments. Every government in the wasteland faced the same legitimacy crisis. None of them could credibly claim they represented the people's will, because none of them had ever asked for it. They were gun-backed occupations, and everyone knew it. When a government lacks legitimacy, people don't invest in its future. They hide resources, avoid taxes, keep their real skills secret. You see it in Diamond City's refusal to expand beyond the wall, in Good Neighbor's black market economy, in every settlement that pays tribute to raiders, while secretly planning to bolt the moment protection fails. The Minutemen tried to build bottom-up legitimacy through voluntary cooperation, and it worked until it didn't. Preston Garvey spent his days begging for help because no one believed the organization would still exist in 6 months. But legitimacy wasn't the deepest problem. The calendar was. In the Commonwealth, average life expectancy for non-vault dwellers was 34 years. Super mutants, radiation, starvation, disease, raiders. Most wastelanders genuinely expected to die within 5 years, and they planned accordingly. When your time horizon is that short, you optimize for extraction, not construction. You strip the copper wiring instead of repairing the grid. You eat the Brahmin instead of breeding them. You sell the medicine instead of training doctors. Every individual decision makes sense, and together, they guarantee nothing ever gets built. The Vault Dwellers' Survival Guide warned about exactly this. Communities needed members who expected to see their grandchildren grow up in the same settlement. Without that, You got raider economics. Take everything now, because there is no later. You can see it in Megaton's architecture. Rusted aircraft parts held together with whatever was lying around, because no one thought they'd still be living there in 20 years. 165 years after the bombs fell, and they were still building temporary. And the few who did plan long-term discovered they'd been planning for the wrong thing. In 2162, Shady Sands had a choice: invest in expanding their farms, or keep food production minimal and focus on defense. They chose farms, betting that the California climate would stay stable. By 2241, they'd become the new California Republic. In the Commonwealth, a dozen settlements made the same bet and died when the rain patterns shifted. No one knew if nuclear winter was ending or permanent, if the dust would settle or keep circling, if rain would return to the capital wasteland, or if desertification was forever. Every long-term construction project was a gamble on climate data that didn't exist. Vault 101's agricultural deck failed because Vault-Tec's models assumed stable conditions. The pit's raiders controlled the city because the cloud of radioactive smog never cleared like projections said it would. Building farms and cities meant betting decades of labor on a forecast no one could make. So communities stayed mobile. They built in places they could abandon. They kept population below the level that would starve if they had to relocate next spring. It looked like failure to rebuild, but it was actually the only rational response to living on a planet whose climate had been fundamentally destabilized, which explains why the most important rebuilding efforts are the ones you never see in the games. In Modoc, population 43, someone spent 8 years mapping the aquifer under their Brahmin pens and marking the depths in a notebook made from pre-war tax forms. In Arroyo, they kept weather records on cave walls, tracking first frost dates across 6 generations. Vault City's seed vault held 127 viable strains, each tested for radiation tolerance, each requiring 4 years to verify. The games never show you this work, because it's invisible until it fails. A hand-dug well takes 9 months and feeds 30 people for decades, but one raider with a grenade ends it in 4 seconds. Irrigation channels, root cellars, the knowledge of which pre-war fertilizers are safe to use. It all compounds slowly, pays off in 20 years, and dies in an afternoon. Shady Sands had 11 families keeping different crop strains alive, each one a backup in case blight hit the others. That redundancy took 3 generations to build and looked like wasteful duplication to anyone passing through. And every time a settlement gets close to surplus, the same thing happens. The year Canterbury Commons stored 400 pounds of dried corn, they got hit twice. The year after that, when they only grew what they'd eat by winter, nobody came. Raiders don't attack randomly. They attack economically. And a full-grain silo is a signal flare you can see from 10 miles away through the smoke and ash. Settlements learned to hide success, fake poverty, bury the surplus, trade quietly at night. But that meant no growth, no investment, no reason for merchants to stop or skilled workers to stay. The alternative was walls, guards, and guns, which meant diverting 40% of your labor to defense instead of production. Either way, you flatline. Hide your surplus, and you can't leverage it into better tools or more hands. Militarize, and you're spending tomorrow's seeds on today's bullets. The math was brutal, and it was everywhere. Settlements that succeeded got punished for it, so most learned to succeed just enough to survive and no further. But a few settlements found a third option, and it changed everything. The hub didn't grow anything. They sat on a crossroads, charged 8 caps per caravan for clean water and a guarded campsite, and kept records of who cheated who. By 2161, they were processing 60 caravans a month and had never planted a single crop. Raiders left them alone because a dead hub was worth nothing, but a living hub was where you sold your loot. The trick was neutrality. The hub enforced contracts between everyone, including raiders, which meant burning them down would cost every faction their only trusted middleman. They taxed trade, not production, so they never hoarded the resources that made you a target. Crimson Caravan and the water merchants operated out of the hub because it was the one place deal-breaking got you blacklisted by everyone. Within 40 years, 6 other settlements copied the model. Junktown, the Boneyards markets, even New Reno in its own twisted way. They all survived by becoming infrastructure instead of treasure chests. The Wasteland's first real cities weren't built on farms, they were built on trust, contracts, and the 3% they skimmed off every deal. Their model spread slowly, but it ran into a problem no one saw coming. By 2189, the Crimson Caravan Company controlled 60% of the Brahmin trade between the Boneyard and the hub. The Fargo traders wanted that market share. What followed wasn't a price war, it was a shooting war. 14 caravan guards dead over 8 months, all because 2 merchant families couldn't agree who got to tax the road between Dayglow and Aditum. The hub's council tried to mediate. Both sides nodded, signed a treaty, then immediately hired more guns. Within 3 years, you had toll stations every 20 miles, each one run by a different family, each one demanding their cut. A trader moving ghoul-scavenged pre-war goods from Necropolis to Junktown paid 7 different fees before the Brahmin even saw the city gates. This wasn't raiders disrupting trade. This was trade disrupting itself. The merchant republics had simply reinvented feudalism with better accounting, replacing warlords with trading houses that acted exactly like warlords the moment their profit margins got squeezed, which revealed the one thing the wasteland had in abundance that no one wanted to admit. Armed factions. The Mojave alone had 6 major powers and 19 named raider gangs, competing for a stretch of desert that sustained maybe 40,000 people pre-war. The capital wasteland had the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the Super Mutants, Talon Company, the Regulators, Paradise Falls Slavers, and 11 distinct raider clans, all killing each other over the ruins of a city that couldn't feed 200 people without imports. Every settlement that got strong enough to matter immediately spawned a warlord. Every warlord needed troops. Every troop needed to eat, which meant every new strongman made the resource problem worse while claiming he was the solution. The NCR spent 40 years just trying to get the Barstow gangs to stop shooting Brahmin caravans. They never succeeded. They just killed enough gang leaders that the survivors pretended to stop. It's not that the wasteland lacks order. It's drowning in microstates, each one defended by 12 guys with pipe rifles who think they are the legitimate government. Cooperation requires everyone disarming at once, but the first faction to put down their guns dies in a week, and the few visionaries who tried to break the cycle discovered the wasteland had one more trap waiting. President Tondi ruled the NCR for 52 years, turned 5 towns into a nation of 700,000 people, built the only functional republic the wasteland had seen since the bombs. She died in 2248. Within 10 years, the NCR Senate was bought by Brahmin barons, and expansionist hawks turned her defensive federation into an imperial land-grab machine that bled troops into the Mojave for resources it didn't need. Elder Owen Lyons broke with the Brotherhood's tech-hoarding doctrine, spent 20 years defending capital wasteland settlers for free, trying to prove the Brotherhood could be more than glorified scavengers. His own outcasts split off and called him a traitor. The moment he died, Elder Maxon purged the reformers and went right back to the original doctrine, charity mission over. The Vault Dwellers saved the wasteland, founded Arroyo, tried to build a community that didn't shoot first. Vault 13's overseer exiled him anyway, because he'd seen too much, become too changed. The settlement he built lasted, but his vision didn't. His grandson destroyed the Enclave, then walked away from the NCR entirely, because it had already forgotten what his grandfather died for. Every reformer gets one generation, maybe two if they're lucky. Then the old guard coups them, or their successors reverse the reforms, or they get a bullet in a dark hallway because someone preferred the wasteland the way it was. Because the wasteland doesn't just kill reformers, it kills the idea of reform. After 210 years, the wasteland has learned its lesson. You don't plan for next year. You don't talk about fixing the water plant or replanting the orchard. You scavenge today's meal. You watch the horizon for raiders, and you die before anything you started gets finished. It's not pessimism anymore. It's pattern recognition. Your grandmother tried to organize a militia, got shot by the people she was protecting because they thought she was consolidating power. Your uncle tried to restart a factory, ran it for 3 years. Then a super mutant warband burned it down on a Tuesday. Every settlement that builds something bigger than itself gets a target painted on its back. So people perform survival instead. They say the right words about rebuilding when a caravan comes through. They nod along when someone proposes a community project, but nobody actually believes it'll work. The ones who do believe it, who talk about the future like it's a real place they'll live to see, those people are dangerous. They make you hope, and hope gets you killed. But that collective despair is hiding something the games never show you directly. In Fallout 1, the average wastelander lives to maybe 35, can't read, and has never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. By Fallout 4, life expectancy in the major settlements has crept up to 60. Literacy in the NCR is around 75%. The Crimson Caravan runs routes across 1,200 miles of territory on a schedule you can actually rely on. Shady Sands went from 50 people living in tents to a functioning republic with 700,000 citizens, a postal service, and a tax code. The hub rebuilt enough infrastructure that 6 separate merchant houses can compete without anyone starving. Diamond City feeds 900 people year-round inside a baseball stadium in the middle of a radioactive swamp. It's not flashy. There's no ribbon-cutting ceremony when infant mortality drops 3%. Nobody celebrates the year a trade route stays open for 12 consecutive months. The progress happens in the space between games, in the decades the player never sees, so slowly that the people living through it think nothing's changing at all. And that invisibility explains the real answer to the original question. Rome took 500 years to build from a collection of hill forts to the empire we remember. The Mongol Empire needed 4 generations to go from steppe nomads to the largest contiguous territory in human history. Post-Roman Britain spent 300 years as a radioactive wasteland of its own. Illiterate warlords fighting over the ruins of aqueducts they couldn't rebuild, before anything resembling civilization crawled back. The Great War happened in 2077. Fallout 4 takes place in 2287. That's 210 years. The NCR is younger than the United States was during the Civil War. Diamond City is newer than the Articles of Confederation. By the standards of actual post-collapse recovery, the wasteland is rebuilding at breakneck speed. But wastelanders don't compare themselves to medieval Europe or post-collapse societies that took 15 generations to remember how to make glass. They compare themselves to the old world. They're standing in the ruins of an airport that used to launch 300 flights a day, and they've managed to get one trade caravan running twice a month, and they call that failure. Which means the problem was never that no one was rebuilding. It's a measurement problem. When a settlement gets running water for 50 people, they're not comparing that to other towns in the wasteland. They're comparing it to the pre-war city of 50,000 that had pressurized water to every floor of every building 24 hours a day for 200 years straight. Every wastelander is measuring their progress against a 2077 that took 300 years of continuous industrial growth to build. They're standing next to a fusion reactor they can't fix, and calling their working water pump a joke. They scraped together 12 beds and a Brahmin pen, and they're ashamed because the ruins around them used to sleep 40,000. It's not that rebuilding is slow. It's that the finish line is defined as matching a civilization that had petroleum infrastructure, global supply chains, and 8 billion people contributing labor. You're 6 farmers with 4 rifles. The comparison was always going to destroy you. And that comparison is exactly what someone wanted. Vault-Tec built their entire control system on nostalgia. Every vault was filled with pre-war posters, holotapes of old TV shows, Nuka-Cola machines still humming in the corners. They made sure every person who walked out of a vault spent 200 years worshipping 2077 as paradise. So when they hit the surface, they'd see themselves as fallen, never as pioneers. The Enclave did the same thing. They kept calling themselves the United States government 160 years after the United States ended, kept wearing the old uniforms, kept playing the old anthem. They wanted mainlanders to see them as the legitimate heirs, which meant mainlanders had to accept that legitimacy required looking backward, not forward. The Institute went further. They sent synths to the surface, dressed like wastelanders, but their whole pitch to kidnap victims was, "We're restoring the old world, come underground where it's clean." They needed the surface to stay broken, so they kept wastelanders emotionally anchored to a world that would never come back. If you're worshipping the past, you can't confidently build a future. But the nostalgia trap had one more layer no one expected. Fallout the game is a brand, and the brand requires ruins. If the new California Republic actually rebuilt California into a functional industrial state, with paved roads and universities and a tax system, you couldn't sell that as a Fallout game. The aesthetic is the product. Players want to explore a red rocket station frozen in 2077, not a settlement that tore it down and built a school. So every sequel resets progress. Fallout 2 had cities with economies and laws. Then Fallout 3 jumped across the country to show DC still drinking irradiated puddles 200 years later. New Vegas had the NCR running an actual government. Then Fallout 4 put you back in a wasteland, where no one's formed a nation yet. 76 went earlier in the timeline just to make sure nothing was built. The game needs the wasteland to stay a wasteland, which means the lore has to invent reasons why progress is impossible. It's not a bug, it's the core design. You can't have a Fallout game where the setting looks like a normal society, so the world is structured to make sure rebuilding never finishes. The franchise itself is the final enemy of reconstruction. And in the lore, that translates to one final, hidden force. The maps we explore are crime scenes, not census data. Diamond City exists because it's struggling with synth paranoia. Megaton gets screen time because it's built around an unexploded bomb. Shady Sands appeared in Fallout 1 when it was a 2-Brahmin village, then returned in New Vegas as a distant government, then got nuked off screen. Arroyo in Fallout 2 thrives for 80 years, then vanishes from the series. The Abbey of the Road Monastery rebuilds sustainably for decades, teaches agriculture, maintains infrastructure, never shows up again. Vault City creates a functioning republic with universal healthcare and advanced medicine. One game, then gone. We don't visit stable civilizations because stable civilizations don't need a protagonist. The game camera only points at breakdown, so we see Appalachia 25 years post-war still littered with skeletons. But we never visit the Midwest settlements that figured out crop rotation. The Institute rebuilds an entire underground tech paradise over 200 years. You only go there to destroy it. Every thriving community is off-map or pre-destroyed, creating a survivorship bias that makes collapse look inevitable, when really, we're just not rendering the functional parts. Which means the real question was never about building, it was about what you build for. Pre-war America had a myth, manifest destiny. The shining city on a hill, democracy's inevitable victory, a future where fusion power and robots solved everything. It was a lie, but it was a shared lie, and shared lies build nations. The wasteland has no myth, just survival. Rivet City organizes around an aircraft carrier because it's there, not because carrier states mean anything. The pit rebuilds steel production because the mills survived, not because they're building toward a vision of a post-scarcity industrial future. They're building because the hammer is already in their hand. When the NCR tries to articulate what it's for, the speeches sound like theme park recordings. President Tondi invokes the old flag, the old constitution, the old borders. Not because those things worked. They manifestly ended in species-level annihilation, but because nobody's written a new story. So communities rebuild power grids to run pre-war appliances, re-establish trade routes to move pre-war goods, fight over pre-war weapons, using pre-war tactics toward pre-war goals. They're building, but they're building a museum, and imitating the old world is exactly what guarantees the cycle repeats. The NCR's constitution is a photocopy of a photocopy. They rebuilt Congress, the two-party system, expansionist foreign policy, and a military-industrial complex. In 100 years, they recreated every structural condition that led to the resource wars, then acted surprised when they ended up in a resource war over Hoover Dam. President Kimball gives speeches about democracy's triumph, while the Brahmin barons buy Senate votes and the military runs black sites. The West Coast has clean water, hospitals, schools, and currency, and it's using all of it to become pre-war America. Not the propaganda version, the real version, corruption and oligarchy included. The Brotherhood hoards technology because they remember what technology did, but they have no framework for what ELSE to do, so they just sit in bunkers waiting for purpose. The followers of the apocalypse teach engineering and medicine, but can't teach why, so their students leave to join armies. 200 years after the bombs, and not one faction has sat down to design a governmental model that doesn't end in nuclear fire. They've rebuilt the roads, the guns, the flags, the borders. Nobody's rebuilt the idea, except for one group, and their solution was worse than the problem. Caesar looked at the old world and saw weakness. Democracy bred complacency, technology made people soft, and mercy created the conditions for collapse. His legion rejected all of it, burned the libraries, crucified the profligates, and built a society on brutal discipline. But here's the thing, Caesar never understood. He wasn't rejecting the old world. He was worshiping it just as hard as the NCR, just from the opposite direction. They wanted to resurrect its best parts. He wanted to punish its worst. But both were still obsessed with what came before. The Legion's entire identity was defined by what the old world did wrong. Every crucifixion, every enslaved tribe, every burned book was an argument against pre-war values. You can't spend 200 years rejecting something without letting it control you. But both the NCR and the Legion missed what the wasteland was actually teaching. Because while everyone was fighting over whether to restore democracy or punish it, the wasteland was quietly evolving something new. Small trading posts that didn't need courts, caravan networks that worked without highways, communities that survived on reputation and barter instead of taxes and laws. It's decentralized, flexible, and built for a world where you can't trust your neighbor, but still need to trade with them. No massive bureaucracy, no standing armies, just enough structure to keep the bullets pointed outward. The Mojave had dozens of these settlements before the NCR and Legion showed up to civilize them. This wasn't failure to rebuild. It was adaptation to a fundamentally different world. But when you're busy trying to resurrect the old one, you can't see the new one taking shape. You're teaching people that their survival systems are temporary, that real civilization means going back, that what's working now doesn't count. And a few communities have started to listen. Good Neighbor isn't trying to be Boston. It's a neighborhood of ghouls and drifters who took over a hotel, built their own rules, and kept the chems flowing. Freeside isn't trying to be Vegas. It's 3 gangs and a soup kitchen that somehow keep each other in check. The outer Vegas settlements aren't suburbs. They're fortified farms, trading Brahmin and bullets. These places don't have founding documents or electoral systems. They have Hancock deciding cases from a balcony, the kings enforcing their turf through Elvis impersonation, and farmers who'll shoot you for stealing corn but share water when the wells run dry. It's not democracy, and it's not dictatorship. It's something that only exists because the old world died. And nobody there wastes time mourning what was lost, because they're too busy making sure they have enough caps for ammo, and enough ammo to get more caps. They're building a hybrid culture from salvaged parts, and it works precisely because it doesn't worship anything. But that hybrid culture runs into one last obstacle, the old world left behind. Look at where people actually live in the capital wasteland. Megaton is built inside a bomb crater around an unexploded nuke. Rivet City is a pre-war aircraft carrier with the bridge torn off. Diamond City is Fenway Park with sheet metal welded over the grandstands. Every major settlement is parasitic on a pre-war structure, which means every major settlement is trapped by pre-war geometry. You can't redesign a stadium. You can't rethink a carrier's layout. You're stuck with corridors that go where the old world wanted them to go, rooms shaped for purposes that don't exist anymore, and architecture that forces you to think like the people who built it. Even the ones that try something new end up conforming. Good Neighbor is just another neighborhood in Boston, walls built between old buildings. Canterbury Commons is a traffic circle. Nobody's drawing up blueprints for a city designed around Brahmin caravans or mutfruit agriculture, or the actual needs of 2277, because the scaffolding is already there, and it's easier to hang your life on someone else's bones. And the one settlement that did start from scratch revealed the answer. Arroyo was founded in 2167 by the Vault Dweller and a group of Vault exiles who had no pre-war ruins to crawl into. So they built tribal, adapted to the high desert, learned to farm hardy crops and hunt gecko, and developed a culture that worked for the world they actually lived in. For 80 years they thrived without electricity, without pre-war tech, without any nostalgic anchor to the old world. Then the elders started telling stories about the Garden of Eden creation kit, a magic box that could terraform the wasteland back into Eden, restore what was lost, make the world green again. And suddenly, thriving wasn't enough. Suddenly, adaptation was just a placeholder for restoration. By 2241, the village was dying, not because their methods stopped working, but because they'd been taught to want something they didn't have. The Chosen One's entire quest was chasing that restoration myth, and when they finally got a GECK, using it didn't save Arroyo. What saved Arroyo was migration, merging with Vault-13, and building something new in a new place. The restoration myth nearly killed them. Which means the real poison isn't the radiation, it's the restoration myth itself. The Garden of Eden Creation Kit is a briefcase-sized terraforming device that can supposedly turn wasteland into paradise overnight. Cold fusion power source, atmospheric processors, seed bank, soil supplements, the whole package. One GECK and you're done. Except nobody's done, because the GECK teaches you to wait instead of work. Why build an irrigation system when a GECK will make the rain come back? Why breed radiation-resistant crops when a GECK will give you pre-war seeds that grow in clean soil? Why develop new construction techniques when a GECK will just rebuild the suburbs? It's a miracle box that turns incremental progress into wasted effort. And every hour spent searching for one is an hour not spent building something real. And Vault-Tec knew exactly what they were doing. The GECK was never about saving humanity. It was about making sure vault dwellers stayed dependent on Vault-Tec solutions, stayed hungry for pre-war answers, stayed trapped in the belief that restoration was possible and adaptation was failure. It's a hope bomb that detonates the moment you start believing in it. And every search for a GECK, a platinum chip, or a superweapon is the same mistake. Because every Fallout story ends with a superweapon. Liberty Prime marching on the Enclave, the molecular relay punching a hole into the Institute, the Sierra Madre's vending machines that could print infinite supplies, the Archimedes II orbital laser, the Prydwen's aerial firepower. Each one could rebuild a civilization if you pointed it the right direction. Liberty Prime's fusion power could run a city for 200 years. The molecular relay proves teleportation works. Those vending machines solve scarcity forever if you move them to a settlement. But no one ever does. Every superweapon gets used exactly once, for war, then abandoned or destroyed. Because wasteland logic only knows how to see tools as weapons. The Brotherhood sees Liberty Prime and thinks about killing synths. The sole survivor finds the relay and thinks about invading the Institute. Father Elijah finds infinite resources and thinks about gassing the Mojave. It's not stupidity. It's 200 years of training that says the person with the biggest gun survives, and the person trying to build something gets shot. But one community finally figured out how to break that logic. The Atom Cats took power armor, the single most valuable military asset in the wasteland, and turned it into hot rods. They race them, they paint them, they installed fucking chrome. Power armor that the Brotherhood hoards for war, that raiders kill for, that could tip any battle in the Commonwealth, and the Atom Cats use it to do donuts in a parking lot while listening to pre-war rockabilly. They proved wasteland tech can be repurposed for joy instead of death. And they remain 6 people in a garage, not because their idea is bad, but because there's no economic path from racing power armor to feeding 100 people. No one pays caps to watch races. No caravan routes depend on their existence. The rest of the Commonwealth barely knows they're there. They've got the cultural shift figured out, the moment where a weapon becomes art. But culture doesn't scale without infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't get built without returns. And those incentive structures are the final answer. Rebuilding requires investing now for returns in 50 years. You plant an orchard, you don't eat for a decade. You train engineers, they're useless until they're 30. You build a school, it costs 10,000 caps today, and maybe reduces crime in 2310. But scavenging pays off in 50 hours. You crack open an office building, you've got pre-war food and sellable junk by nightfall. Raiding pays off in 5 hours. You hit a caravan, you eat tonight. The wasteland economy rewards extraction because extraction has immediate returns that keep you alive. There's no bank that loans caps for a 50-year construction project. No investor class that can wait out a generation. No government bonds, no pension funds, no market mechanism to move resources from today into deep future payoffs. Every cap you spend on rebuilding is a cap you can't spend on bullets, and bullets keep you alive until Tuesday. So communities stay small, stay mobile, stay armed, because that's what the economy pays for. The wastelander who tries to build a library starves. The one who joins a raider gang eats. Which means the real reason no one rebuilds is simpler than conspiracy or genetics. Because when you're alone in the Mojave with 3 caps and a broken rifle, scavenging pre-war ruins makes more sense than planting corn. When your neighbor has food and you have a gun, taking it is faster than growing it. When every stranger might kill you for your shoes, sharing anything is suicide. Game theorists call this a Nash equilibrium. Everyone's making the smartest choice, given what everyone else is doing. And the result is a world where no one can afford to stop. The raider raids because farmers exist. The farmer hoards because raiders exist. The trader charges extortion prices because everyone's desperate. And everyone's desperate because traders charge extortion prices. It's not that wastelanders are stupid or evil. It's that cooperation is a luxury you buy with surplus, and there is no surplus. A merchant who gives fair prices gets robbed. A farmer who shares his harvest starves. A settlement that opens its gates gets sacked. The wasteland punishes virtue and rewards paranoia, so virtue dies out and paranoia spreads. You can't blame individuals for surviving, but you also can't build a civilization when survival requires betraying every principle civilization needs. And there is one force that could break that equilibrium, but it requires the one thing the wasteland has never had. Time, not just years, but generations of safety. You need parents who don't have to teach their kids to shoot before they teach them to read. You need farmers who can plant orchards that won't bear fruit for a decade. You need builders who can invest in roads and wells and schools, knowing they'll live long enough to use them. But here's the trap. To get that safety, you need walls, guards, and enough food stored to survive a bad harvest. Which means you need to build before you're safe. You need to farm before you can defend the farm. You need to trust your neighbors before you know if they're trustworthy. It's a chicken and egg problem written in blood. Break the cycle for 1 year and raiders kill you. Break it for 5 years and a drought kills you. Break it for 10 years and you still don't have the schools or hospitals or trade networks you need. You need 20, 30, maybe 50 years of uninterrupted peace to raise a generation that thinks building is normal. And in 200 years of post-war history, across the entire American wasteland, almost no one has managed it. The Brotherhood hoards, the Enclave collapses, the Institute hides. Caesar builds an army that dies with him, except in one place, and no one noticed because it happened so slowly. Shady Sands in 2161 was 5 buildings and a Brahmin pen. Aradesh led maybe 50 people, and their biggest problem was rad scorpions in the well. When he died, his daughter Tandi took over. She was 16. By the time she died in 2248, Shady Sands was the capital of a republic with 700,000 citizens. That's 87 years, 2 leaders, 2 generations of kids who grew up behind walls that held, eating food that kept coming, watching their parents solve problems with votes instead of bullets. And those kids, the ones who never knew the pre-Tandy chaos, they're the ones who built the NCR's bureaucracy, its laws, its taxes, its boring institutional weight. It wasn't a GECK. It wasn't a charismatic warlord. It wasn't old world tech or a vault experiment. It was an old woman holding a town together long enough that her grandchildren forgot what hunger felt like. Long enough that stability became normal, and normal became worth defending, and defending it became a job instead of a crisis. The NCR has problems, plenty of them, but it has problems civilizations have. Corruption, overreach, taxes, gridlock. Not whether everyone eats this winter, not whether raiders burn the crops, which means the answer was always time, land, and luck. Shady Sands gave us the blueprint. 50 years minimum without a super mutant army, a nuclear detonation, or a warlord with power armor deciding your farmland looks nice. A defendable resource base, something worth protecting that can't be moved when the next threat shows up. Water, arable land, or a pre-war facility that still has something valuable inside. And a leader who lives long enough to train the next generation, who can pass down not just survival skills, but the institutional memory of how to keep a government running. Aradesh had all 3. The Vault Dwellers Village had all 3. The Institute had all 3, which is why they became the Commonwealth's nightmare instead of its savior. Most communities get 2 out of 3. Goodneighbor has the walls and the leadership, but Hancock's been mayor for 11 years, and the city's still one triggerman coup away from collapse. Rivet City has the location and the time, but leadership keeps dying or disappearing. The Mojave has Caesar, but he has a brain tumor and no heir, which means the Legion gets maybe 5 more years. For 210 years, the wasteland has been denying at least one of those requirements to every settlement that tries. But the wasteland is slowly, invisibly, running out of ways to say no. By 2287, the surface is picked clean. The easy guns are gone. The pre-war food is gone. The intact machinery is gone. Scavengers in the Commonwealth are pulling copper wire out of walls and calling it a good day, because there's nothing bigger left to find. Which forces a shift the wasteland hasn't seen since the bombs fell. The NCR is minting its own currency, stamped gold pieces backed by water and Brahmin, because they ran out of caps to scavenge. The Brotherhood is manufacturing vacuum tubes and circuit boards in their foundries, because pre-war parts don't exist anymore. Even the Raiders are learning to farm, planting potatoes and corn in Lexington, because there's nothing left to steal that's worth the bullets. The Gunners are the canary in the coal mine. They're mercenaries, the pinnacle of wasteland scavenger culture, and they're paying bottle caps to wastelanders for scrap metal and burnt books. Not to sell, to use. They're building fortifications, repairing weapons, making ammunition from scratch. When the raiders start acting like settlers and the mercenaries start acting like manufacturers, the economic foundation of the wasteland is cracking. And once scavenging ends, the economic logic that prevented rebuilding collapses. There's a moment coming, maybe 20 years out, maybe 50, when building a new water purifier is cheaper than finding a pre-war one, when teaching your kid to smith is safer than teaching them to scavenge a raider camp, when the merchant routes are predictable enough that you can plant a crop in March and trust it'll still be there in October. That's the tipping point. Not a miracle, not a hero, just the quiet math of a world that's finally run out of shortcuts. And once that flip happens, once production beats scavenging, civilization doesn't rebuild slowly. It accelerates. Settlements become towns. Towns build roads. Roads create trade. Trade creates surplus. Surplus creates specialists. Specialists create technology. The NCR went from 3,000 people in Shady Sands to 700,000 citizens across 5 states in 120 years. Exponential. The Institute went from a basement of scientists to a teleporting army of synths in 110 years. Exponential. The Brotherhood went from a bunker of 50 deserters to a continental military power in 84 years. Exponential. The wasteland is crossing the line right now, in the 2280s, where the next generation won't remember what it was like when scavenging worked. Which means the real story of Fallout isn't about why no one rebuilds. It's about the silent progress that no one sees until it's already won. Shady Sands grows from 50 people in 2061 to a thriving capital by 2241. The Prydwen is a working aircraft carrier built from scrap in 10 years. Acadia runs a functioning synth refuge with hydroponics and clean water. None of this makes it into the marketing. Civilization is invisible because it's boring. We see the Institute when they kidnap someone, not the 200 years they spent underground perfecting synthetic biology. We tour the ruins of the Commonwealth, not the 83 settlements Diamond City traders supply every week. The games show us the wars, because that's when the player arrives. The decades of peace between them, where the real work happens, render in loading screens and terminal entries. The wasteland is healing. We just keep visiting its scars. If you want more Fallout lore that actually lets you sleep at night, the playlist is right there. Thanks for watching. In Fallout 4, there's a random encounter where you meet a trader who's never seen a deathclaw. Born after the worst of it. She sells purified water for 8 caps and doesn't think that's remarkable at all.